Good evening, and thank you for joining the Westerly Library in Wilcox Park for tonight's Community Voices presentation. This program is being presented using the webinar version of Zoom, and attendees are joining in listening mode only. Please send any and all questions through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We will do our best to answer all questions within the time we've allotted for this program. Please note that this is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel as soon as possible. Should you get disconnected, simply use the link that was emailed to you earlier to get back into the program. I will now turn it over to our moderator for tonight, Betty Jo Cugini.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight for Community Voices History and Balance series. We want to welcome you to this monthly program that explores in depth the individuals, the groups, and historical events that inform the character of our local area. This series grew out of a desire to better unite us by bridging our differences. Each month, we will focus on a singular aspect of life in our community. We hope you will join us regularly as we highlight the people, the customs, the folklore of life in the Westerly Pawcatuck area. This program is for and about you, and we hope that you'll contact us if you have a story you'd like to share. Tonight's program, as you can see, is titled Venture Smith, Why His Life Matters. It's also Venture Smith 101, as we'll hear from our presenters tonight. And the reason for that, as you will hear, is because it's a true primer on Venture Smith, a formerly enslaved Black man who spent time in this area. The presenters tonight are Dr. Nancy Steenburg, a graduate of Harvard University, Trinity College, and the University of Connecticut. She is currently teaching history at UConn Avery Point. And joining her is Liz Kading, who is a graduate of UConn and has worked with Dr. Steenburg for over 15 years doing research on Venture Smith and other local history topics. So good evening to our presenters, to all of our viewers. We invite you to sit back, relax, and enjoy tonight's very important program. Ladies.
Thank you very much, Betty Jo and Amanda. We're very happy to be here because Venture has been a part of our lives since 2005. The word hero often evokes thoughts of great deeds that change the course of history. But an equally valuable definition of hero is a person admired for achievements and qualities, or one who shows great courage. When examining the history of enslaved Africans and African Americans in the American colonies or in the United States of America, few white writers have ever recorded deeds by slaves or even free Blacks that would meet that first definition. But many Black people often fulfilled the terms of the second, yet they rarely left a written record of their achievement. Tonight, Liz and I will be speaking about a man who was born in Africa in 1729. His name was Brotier Furo, although he eventually adopted the name Venture Smith. He was born in freedom in Africa, enslaved as a child, and brought to New England. And he eventually lived in Stonington for 20 years, both as an enslaved man and as a free person. Venture never played a role on the public stage, but in defending himself from the injustices of slavery, in working steadfastly for his freedom and for the freedom of his wife and children, and in making a place for himself in white-dominated colonial society, he illustrated notable courage and achievement in the face of great adversity. How does a child of 6, torn from his family and raised in bondage, develop the traits we recognize as heroic? Well, in his autobiography that Venture dictated to a school teacher named Elisha Niles in 1798, titled A Narrative of the Life and Adventures of Venture, a native of Africa, but resident above 60 years in the United States of America, Venture provides the keys to understanding his personal heroism and the reason for taking note of his life. Yet there's a question: why did the white-owned newspaper, the Bee of New London, even bother to publish the story of an elderly former slave? The answer lies in Connecticut's passage of the gradual abolition law in 1784. That law freed all children in the state of Connecticut born to enslaved mothers if the children were born after March 1st, 1784. The children remained in a form of apprenticeship until they reached the age of 25, but they were not slaves. At age 25, they became free people. All other enslaved people remained enslaved, but many Connecticut slave owners began to free their slaves, leading to a growing population of free Black people. These free Black people, however, had limited access to jobs. Rarely did they receive any education. Few had the resources to buy land, to become farmers or entrepreneurs. Almost all free Blacks were impoverished and lived in terrible living conditions. Some even committed crimes to try to support themselves and their families. In fact, Connecticut prison and jail records showed a higher proportion of Black people incarcerated for petty crimes and intoxication. Because of this, by 1790s, many white Connecticut citizens began to reconsider gradual abolition. They complained that former slaves were lazy, and they feared that they would become a public charge on white taxpayers. The publication of Venture's narrative was to counter these accusations. The narrative shows a Black person could become a successful, contributing member of society if he or she had the opportunity to work and eventually to own land. The introduction to the publication made clear that argument. The subject of the following pages, had he received only a common education, might have been a man of high respectability, suited to his genius. He might have been an ornament and an honor to human nature. It may not be displeasing to see the efforts of a great mind, wholly uncultivated, enfeebled and depressed by slavery, and struggling under every disadvantage. The reader may here see a Franklin and a Washington, a state of nature, or rather in a state of slavery. Destitute as he is of all education and broken by hardships and the infirmities of age, he still exhibits striking traces of native ingenuity and good sense. The narrative exhibits a pattern of honesty, prudence, and industry to people of his own color, and perhaps some white people would not find themselves degraded by imitating such an example. Venture's narrative and Venture's life illustrated that a Black person was equally as capable as any white person, given the same opportunities, an argument that still resonates today. Now, the community of Westerly had an interesting history of slavery that ties into this theme. Two histories of the town, Westerly and its Witnesses, and the Seventh-day Baptist Memorial, both written in the second half of the 19th century, downplayed the existence of slavery and its harshness in the community. The records of the Seventh-day Baptist Church revealed fewer than a dozen Black members of the congregation through the 18th century. Westerly and its Witnesses claimed Westerly never had many slaves within its borders. These all disappeared immediately after the Revolution. Yet that same book listed 56 Blacks in the Westerly census of 1730, found Black men and women in the estate inventories of Westerly residents, and even cited over 500 slaves in the 1780 census for the state of Rhode Island, identifying James Babcock and Colonel Joseph Stanton of Westerly as men who owned up to 40 slaves each. Even the 1776 estate inventory of former Governor Samuel Ward listed 2 slaves, Peggy, a Negro woman, and James, a Negro boy, both valued at 12 pounds. In addition, how could the slave population of Westerly have been so small? Yet Westerly and its Witnesses described multiple graveyards that were the resting places of mostly unidentified Black people, including Philis Jumbo, who died at age 100. And in this cemetery, she's buried here, but her stone is not marked. Orson, who died at age 100, and members of the Ray family who lived in a section of Westerly called Guinea, because Ray's mother had been kidnapped in Africa, known as Guinea, and brought to the United States as a slave. Interestingly, however, Westerly and its Witnesses had a similar assessment of the hard life that free Blacks and former enslaved persons faced. But long after slavery had disappeared amongst us, there strangely lingered strong prejudice against the people who had suffered, a prejudice against their color, condition, or capacity. A Black man was regarded as belonging to a class not entitled to all that is bestowed on a white person. Venture matters because he showed a Black man as capable, hardworking, honest, and trustworthy. Venture's story was potentially the story of every African enslaved and sold into bondage.
Okay, before we tell you Venture's story, I want to tell you how Nancy and I went about the work of discovering the evidence of Venture's life in Stonington. We began our search where historians usually do, with the paper trail. Venture's narrative gave us a sometimes inconsistent foundation for our quest, but the real work of finding Venture took place in the Land Records Vault at the Stonington Town Hall, and also in the Stonington Historical Society's Woolworth Library and Research Center, as well as in the archives of the Connecticut State Library in Hartford. We spent countless hours in each of these locations, particularly the vault, combing the records for evidence of Venture Smith. And it was in the vault at Stonington Town Hall that we found, we located the deed recording Venture Smith's 1770 purchase from John and Eunice Dennison of a tract of land adjacent to the property of one of Venture's former owners. That was Thomas Stanton II of Stonington. We also located the deed recording Venture's sale of this property 4 years later for the sum of 100 pounds lawful money to his former owner, Thomas Stanton II. So with copies of the deeds in hand, we began to piece together the chain of title on Venture's property with the hope that we would be able to locate the actual parcel of land Venture had lived on, as well as some significant landmarks, including his home site and the so-called Venture Rock, which was this large glacial erratic. You can kind of see it in that's a label from the water. There was a spring water company and they sold Venture Rock spring water. But anyway, the Venture Rock is a large glacial erratic. It had been a local landmark in the past, but it had been lost to history because the trees grew up around it. It kind of disappeared. We were able to follow the chain of title, which is the series of sales and purchases of what had been Venture's land up to 1854, before we hit a brick wall. We had come tantalizingly close to knowing where in Stonington Venture had lived and worked, but for a time we were frustratingly unable to pinpoint the exact location. For a while, I was driving around Stonington looking for Thomas Stanton II's house and the Great Rock mentioned in the deeds, and I was worrying every time I saw evidence of blasting for new construction. I was like, that's it, that's Venture's Great Rock. It's been obliterated. And I would tell Nancy how despairing I was. But it was a combination of serendipity and technology that finally led us onto Venture's land. One day at lunch at Yukon Avery Point, where we all worked, Nancy was telling our colleague, Peg Stewart Van Patten, about our research on Venture Smith. And Nancy mentioned that we, were despairing of ever finding Venture's land. And to our surprise and delight, Peg informed Nancy that she knew exactly where the property was because she was a descendant of the Stewart family, the last private owners of the Thomas Stanton II homestead, which had stood on the property adjacent to Venture's until it was accidentally burned to the ground in the 1960s. And this is the house Venture lived in when he was owned by Thomas Stanton II, and he lived in the attic there. And so the picture on your left is what the house looked like in its glory. I'm choking. And after it burned down. Oh my gosh, I lost my voice. Okay. Thomas Stanton's property and Venture Smith's property, it turned out, both lie within what is now the Barn Island State Preserve in Pawcatuck. So Peg had in her possession family photos of the Venture Rock, as well as, now notice the trees, there's no trees around the rock, in the older pictures especially. She also had a hand-drawn map of the property. This is Venture's property. And she recalled some lilac bushes that bloomed at the southeastern corner of her grandparents' house. So we were able to make out the lilacs in the photo, you can see there. And as luck would have it, they were blooming when we began our search. So there's Nancy pointing to the lilac, which is where we started. So with the lilac bushes as a starting point and armed with Peg's map, Nancy, Peg, and I, we were assisted by Peg's brother and my husband, were able to locate the last remnants of the Stewart farm structures because they had been razed when the state took over the property. The buildings came down, in addition to the house being burned. So we found the last remnants of the Stewart farm structures and the ruins of the town of Stanton second house. And by orienting ourselves from these structures and using Peg's map, as well as images of the property taken from Google Earth, we could actually see what we were looking for. We managed to hack our way through 42 years worth of vegetation overgrowth in order to locate the Venture Rock and nearby the crumpled, overgrown foundation of Venture's dwelling house, which is down in the right-hand corner there. Our rediscovery of Venture's property in Stonington in 2006 triggered interest in the site that has continued to the present day. And it recently resulted in an intense archaeological survey of the property, which was carried out in 2019 in preparation for the installation of a permanent exhibit of Venture Smith to be housed in the expanded and renovated Stonington Lighthouse Museum when it reopens later this year. So this is how we carried out our research, but now we want to tell you about Venture.
So much of what I'm going to be talking about is directly from Venture's narrative. He dictated it again in the late 1790s. He was born in 1729, so he was an old man. But in describing his father, Venture wrote that his father was a prince of the tribe of Dukandara in Guinea. And Guinea is the south portion of West Africa. It was also known as the Slave Coast by British and American slavers. One recollection Venture had of his father described how his father offered a safe haven to a neighboring tribe that was fleeing an invading army. Venture recalled he was a kind and merciful prince and therefore consented to providing protection for those fleeing oppression. When the invading army threatened Venture's own tribe, his father agreed to pay tribute, saying that he would comply rather than that his subjects should be deprived of their rights and privileges. And he did not take defensive measures because he relied on the faith and honor of the enemy's pledge to protect his tribe from invasion. While Venture's father had a sense of faith and honor, the invaders did not. After taking the tribute they had demanded, the aggressors launched an attack on Venture's family. Venture watched as his father single-handedly tried to fight off the invaders to protect his family, and he witnessed his father's surrender to the superior force. Then this 6-year-old boy had to watch as his father's captors tortured him and cut and pounded on his body with great inhumanity, that he might be induced by the torture he suffered to reveal where he had hidden his money. Reminiscing more than 60 years later, Venture said, "The shocking scene is to this day fresh in my memory, and I have often been overcome thinking about it. Yet the values Venture imbibed from his father, strength and resolution, kindness and affability, and equity and moderation, were an important influence on the rest of his life." After his father's death, the hostile invaders found the boy, still named Rotier, and his family, and marched them to the coast of Guinea, to the fort at Anamabu in West Africa. There, the ship, the Charming Susanna, out of Rhode Island, captained by a man named Collingwood, took on a load of captured Africans for sale in the West Indies. And remember, these people were not slaves born. These were free people who were enslaved by aggression. The steward of the ship, Robinson or Robertson Mumford of Rhode Island and Fisher's Island, purchased the 6-year-old boy as his private investment, naming him Venture. Though he was only 6 years old when enslaved, Venture retained the core values of his father's example. He related an early example of his sense of honor and responsibility. Left in charge of the keys to his owner's trunks and directed by his owner not to give the keys to anyone, even to Mumford's father, Venture promised faithfully to conform. When Mumford's father demanded the keys of Venture, the boy told him that my master entrusted me with the care of them until he should return, and that I had given him my word to be faithful to that trust. Even when the elder Mumford threatened young Venture with punishment, the child refused to go back on his word to his owner. When Robertson Mumford arrived, he told his father that young Venture had been in his native place, so habituated to keeping his word that he would sacrifice even his life to maintain it. Not only did Venture share in his father's model of honor, he also shared in his courage. While a teenager, now owned by George Mumford of Fisher's Island, the father of Robertson, Venture had the misfortune to have to try to serve two masters. James Mumford, the son of George and brother of Robertson, repeatedly would contravene his father's original orders to Venture and order him to perform work for himself instead. This culminated in Mumford attempting to assault Venture with a pitchfork, after Venture had informed him that he must faithfully complete the assigned work for the elder Mumford. In a scene literally reminiscent of Frederick Douglass's battle with the slave breaker Edward Covey, James Mumford attempted to beat Venture over the head with the pitchfork, and Venture grabbed another pitchfork to fend off the blows. Mumford then called to other men working for him and told them to subdue Venture and tie him up. Venture narrated, "They all tried to bind me, but in vain, although there were 3 assistants in number. Only when Mumford had given up on his attempt to beat Venture did he allow the 3 men to tie him up. Though Mumford then tied Venture to a gallows, seemingly in preparation for whipping him, he eventually released him without punishment. Venture had learned the lesson of standing up for himself in the face of the injustice of slavery. I should add, Venture was between 6'1" and 6'3" tall, and the average colonial Connecticut resident male was about 5'6". One of the most damning accusations by abolitionists against the system of slavery was that it destroyed the families of slaves. Frederick Douglass, in his narrative, noted many examples of slaves who could not protect their own wives and children from punishment or abuse. Harriet Jacobs, in her book, My Life as a Slave Girl, was highly critical of how slavery normally destroyed family ties because the parents had no rights to their children and could not protect them. Whites also did not respect slave marriages. Lorenzo Green claimed in his study of Blacks in colonial New England that slaves could not exercise full marital rights since they were the possessions of their owners. Whatever the norm for slaves in New England, in Venture's experience of slavery's effect on his family, he followed the example set by his father, constituting himself the protector of his wife Meg and his 3 children. Late in his narrative, Venture wrote that he had married his wife Meg for love. Certainly, he sought to fulfill the role of a responsible husband and father. When Venture was about 22, he had married Meg, who was a slave also owned by George Mumford. Venture participated in an abortive escape attempt shortly after marriage in 1754. And that's an original newspaper article, the runaway slave ad, posted by George Mumford when Venture ran away. It includes a description of Venture, so we know he was a real person. Because Venture returned to Mumford, Mumford still sold him away from his family to Thomas Stanton II of Stonington, Connecticut. The sale was in 1754. This forced separation of Venture from Meg and their month-old daughter, Hannah. 18 months later, Stanton bought Meg and Hannah, reuniting the family. The couple had 2 more children, sons Solomon and Cuff. Venture wrote that toward the close of the time that Stanton had owned him, he had not only to protect his wife from violence, but he had to protect himself from an assault by his owner. Venture was working out in the barn. You saw the picture of the barn and the picture of the house. Venture heard a quarrel between Mrs. Stanton and his wife, Meg. The quarrel was over what he called such a mere trifle that in his narrative, he would not discuss the details, he said, to avoid putting his former owners to shame. First, Mrs. Stanton beat Meg. Venture tried to intervene by asking his wife to apologize to Mrs. Stanton. Even as he was trying to diffuse the situation, Mrs. Stanton turned the blows that she was delivering on his wife on Venture. She took down a horsewhip and began to beat Venture. And he said, while she was glutting her fury with the whip, I reached out my great black hand, raised it up, and received the blows of the whip on it, which were designed for my head. Then I immediately committed the whip to the devouring flame. Venture did not retaliate against Mrs. Stanton, yet as his father had fought single-handedly to try to protect his wives and children, Venture stood up to Mrs. Stanton to protect Meg. Now, 18th century Connecticut laws did provide some protection for slaves against physical abuse by their masters. Venture did not take immediate action to protest the beating Mrs. Stanton had inflicted on him, nor did Thomas Stanton II initially react to Venture's defiance. Nevertheless, a few days after the incident, while Venture was putting wood on the fireplace, Stanton began beating him on the head with a wooden club 2 feet long and as large around as a chair post, wounding Venture and leaving a scar that he carried for the rest of his life. As Venture had previously stood up to James Mumford, so too he stood up to Thomas Stanton, snatched the club out of his hand and dragged him outside. When Thomas Stanton called to his brother Robert to help him subdue Venture, Venture sought not merely redress, but justice. Instead of attacking the Mumfords, seeking personal revenge for their abuse, Venture sought a legal remedy for his master's attack on him. Taking the club with him as evidence, Venture went to a neighboring justice of the peace and complained of Stanton's abuse. We think this was to Amos Chesbrough, who was the justice of the peace in Stonington at the time closest to the Thomas Stanton second farm. The justice was fully empowered to issue a bond for good behavior against Thomas Stanton, but instead he advised Venture to return to his owner, telling him that if his owner abused him again, he could return and file a formal complaint. Thomas and Robert Stanton arrived at the home of the Justice of the Peace while Venture was still there. And the justice, in Venture's words, improved his convenient opportunity to caution my master. He asked him for what he treated his slaves so unjustly and told him what would be the consequence if he continued the same treatment towards me. After this exchange, Venture might have been justified in believing the laws of Connecticut would protect him from further assaults. His owner quickly disabused him of that notion. Thomas and Robert Stanton rode off for home with Venture walking between them. But when they came to a by-place, they both dismounted from their horses and fell to beating him with great violence. This time, Venture retaliated. He managed to knock both men down and stamp them with his feet. Interestingly, however, neither Robert nor Thomas Stanton seems to have charged Venture with assault, probably aware of how the Justice of the Peace would react to their charges after Venture's earlier complaint against them. Yet Venture had proved to his owner that he would defend himself from harm, even if the laws of the colony would not. This was very similar to a story told by Frederick Douglass when he had been turned over to a man, Edward Covey, known as a slave breaker. Frederick Douglass defied Covey, and Covey never punished Douglass for defending himself, perhaps, as Douglass believed, because Covey did not want to damage his reputation as a harsh taskmaster and slave breaker. Shortly after the Stanton's assault on Venture, he had to face one of the worst fates that constantly threatened enslaved people: sail away from his wife and children. As punishment for Venture's resistance, Thomas Stanton had fitted Venture with handcuffs and leg chains. Thinking this would break Venture's spirit, after a few days, Stanton asked Venture whether he better not be freed from his chains and go to work. Venture remained defiant. When Stanton told Venture he would send him to the West Indies or banish him for his bad behavior, Venture still did not back down and beg his owner's forgiveness. That resistance took courage, because under the laws of the colony, Stanton had the right to sell Venture and destroy Venture's family. Accepting the assurance of Hempstead Miner of Stonington that he would allow him to work to gain his freedom, Miner purchased Venture, and Venture agreed to go with Miner, even though it meant separation from his family. Venture was looking to the future with this offer of freedom, willing to suffer immediate sorrow and loss if it would help him achieve his ultimate goal of freedom for himself and his family. Accepting that separation from his family took courage. But Hempstead Miner, too, proved false, taking Venture to Hartford and attempting to sell him there. Venture refused to go along with this, so when the sale failed, Miner leased Venture to an attorney, Daniel Edwards of Hartford. Venture related that he worked well for Edwards and that Edwards would have bought him, but Edwards told him it would be unreasonable and inconvenient for Venture to be separated from his wife and children. That makes it clear that Venture was unwilling to remain in slavery, even with a so-called good master. His ultimate goal was still to obtain his freedom and the freedom of his family.
Okay, something's blooming that's getting my voice, so we'll see how I do. When he was about 31 years old, Venture finally had a chance to achieve his goal. Sold to Oliver Smith of Stonington around 1760 or 1761, Venture asked Smith if he would allow him to purchase his freedom. When Smith agreed, Venture began working to gain his freedom. This meant that he not only had to meet Smith's need for his labor, a need probably intensified by Smith's building a new home in Stonington in 1761, but he also had to work at night, earning cash to redeem himself. Using money he'd managed to save while Stanton had owned him, Venture bought land in Stonington, adjoining Stanton's land. So this is adjoining Thomas Stanton II's land, his former owner. By cultivating this land with the greatest diligence and economy at times when Smith did not need his labor, Venture managed to earn 10 pounds in 2 years, money he gave to Oliver Smith in partial payment for his freedom. Performing prodigious amounts of labor in the name of freedom was certainly worthy of emulation. The following winter, Venture sought and received the right to go out to work for himself during the season. Smith gave Venture permission, but he required that he pay 25% of his earnings for the privilege. Such an arrangement had also enabled Frederick Douglass to earn money while he lived in Baltimore, but Douglass's master took over 60% of Douglass's wages and also charged him for room and board as well as for the privilege of hiring his time. So Venture clearly had the better arrangement. Venture performed an incredible amount of work once he was working for himself. He said in 6 months working on Long Island, he cut and corded 400 cords of wood, besides threshing out 75 bushels of grain. And during that time, he only spent money to buy himself a pair of shoes. He was willing to deprive himself of normal creature comforts to hasten the day of his freedom. Certainly, such willingness to work hard and suffer deprivation ranks as heroic, at least in the eyes of the family he was working to free. By continuing to work so prodigiously, in 1765, by the time he was 36, Venture succeeded in paying for his freedom from Oliver Smith. In his narrative, Venture mentions that his wife and children were still in bondage to Thomas Stanton II. Over the next 8 years, he continued to work to free them as well. Venture proudly recalls the amazing amount of work he did to achieve this. If this recollection is correct, he was a Black Paul Bunyan, cutting and hewing wood beyond the ability of the average working man. In the first 4 years of his freedom, he cut and corded several thousand cords of wood and earned over 200 pounds. Not only was the amount of work itself amazing, but also Venture's ability to find work was also amazing, considering the difficulty many free Blacks had in finding work. Lorenzo Green asserted that free Blacks had to face the competition of white working men, and as a result, were frequently denied the opportunity of earning a living. Clearly, Venture found work for himself, driven by the goal of freedom for the rest of his family.
During the time that Venture was performing these amazing feats of physical strength, he also was revealing the strengths, the achievements of his personal character. In answer to perhaps a reader's unspoken question, Venture said that during the time he was working to free his family, he spent little on himself. This is a quote. "I bought nothing that I did not absolutely want. All fine clothes I despised in comparison with my interest, and never kept but just what clothes were comfortable for common days. And perhaps I would have a garment or two which I did not have on at all times. But as for superfluous finery, I never thought it to be compared with a decent homespun dress, a good supply of money, and prudence. Expensive gatherings of my mates I commonly shunned, and all kinds of luxuries I was perfectly a stranger to. And during the time I was employed in cutting the aforementioned quantity of wood, I was never at the expense of 6 pence worth of spirits. While such self-denial might not have fit in with whites' expectations of the behavior they expected of free blacks, Venture's behavior provided an admirable model for any citizen, free or slave, black or white, trying to get ahead in life. Now, what has led some analysts to view Venture as a capitalist more than as a family man is that Venture spent money to buy land before he purchased freedom for his sons, and to purchase freedom for his sons before freeing his wife. Now, certainly both were economic decisions, but both perhaps reflected Venture's broader goals to obtain freedom for his family, but also to enable him to support them once they were free. Since finding work was so difficult for free blacks, land ownership was one sure guarantee of security. By depriving himself of the comfort and consolation of his family in the near term, Venture was hastening the day when they would all be free and united, and when he would be able to provide for them as he remembered his father providing for his family back in Africa. Purchasing his 2 sons, Solomon and Cuff, before freeing his wife, Meg, may have reflected Venture's recognition that Thomas Stanton would be more likely to sell the boys than the 35-year-old Meg. Certainly, they would have brought more money. He also may have believed that the boys were more in need of his protection and guidance than their mother. And yes, using their labor would make it easier for Venture to amass the money needed to feed Meg and his daughter, Hannah. Now that Venture's interest in his sons went beyond their financial value to him is clear from his choice to hire Solomon, the elder at age 16, out to Charles Church of Rhode Island for 1 year to give him the opportunity of acquiring some learning. Church was a cooperer, made barrels. Venture also made it clear that the wages for hiring Solomon would be paid to the boy, not to the father. Now, several people have been critical of Venture's placing a monetary value on Solomon's life when Church induced him to go to sea on a whaling voyage and, where poor Solomon died of scurvy. Venture spoke of his attempt to get to port from Pawcatuck, his frantic attempt to protect his son from the dangers of an ocean voyage, and his tremendous grief at his failure to protect his son. Now, Venture did spend some of his hard-earned money on other slaves before he purchased freedom for his wife. There's always a question, why would a former slave enslave other people? Well, one interpretation is that he foresaw that exploiting the labor of such men would increase his wealth, but Venture's own words seem to belie that conclusion. Shortly after paying over $400 to free his sons, Venture purchased a Negro man for no other reason than to oblige him and gave him 60 pounds and set him free. Venture remembered that his father had offered sanctuary to the neighboring tribesmen fleeing aggression, and helping a fellow slave gain his freedom wasn't Venture illustrating the same admirable sense of responsibility. Once Venture had freed his family, he continued to live by the precepts of his father. He sought to provide for his family, moving to Haddam Neck in Connecticut, building a comfortable house beside the Connecticut River. He brought his daughter Hannah to Haddam Neck to care for her because she suffered from a mortal disease, saying he thought it best to bring her to his house and nurse her there. He said, I procured for her all the aid mortals could afford. Now, Hannah was at least 28 years old and married at the time of her death, but Venture still met his parental responsibility to care for her. Living on Haddam Neck, Venture achieved far more than did the average typical freed slave in the late 18th century. He worked and saved his money, eventually was able to buy 100 acres of land in Haddam, owned 10 buildings. He was a successful farmer, shipbuilder, and ship owner. He trusted in his work ethic to get ahead, but it is clear that he retained the strong sense of justice he had learned from his father. Venture repeatedly condemned those whites who had taken advantage of his lack of education and cheated him numerous times. In the most notable case of this, Venture was but a passenger on a vessel owned by an Indian who was delivering molasses to Captain Elisha Hart of Saybrook. Venture was actually away from the Indian's boat, okay, when the molasses fell overboard. Venture had nothing to do with either the delivery of the molasses or the loss of the molasses, but Hart sued him because he had money, rather than suing the Indian who owned the boat because the Indian was unable to pay for the loss. And Hart, before a white jury, won a judgment against Venture for 10 pounds. The indignation at the falsity of Hart's claim still echoes in Venture's own words. Venture went so far as to say of his adversary, "Such a proceeding as this, committed on a defenseless stranger, almost worn out in the hard service of the world, without any foundation of reason or justice, whatever it may be called in a Christian land, would in my native country have been branded as a crime equal to highway robbery." Venture finishes his story with a self-evaluation that reinforces his role as a man to be emulated, not just by his children, but by all honest and upright people. He totals up his worldly goods. He mentions his enduring marriage to Meg, the wife he married for love, and he says, "It gives me joy to think that I have and that I deserve so good a character, especially for truth and integrity." As a mark of this, Venture was buried in the white part of the East Haddam Congregational Church Cemetery with a stone fully carved with this notation. Venture's grave is still there, and it can be seen, and people who've analyzed the grave have said that the death's head actually has African features. So the person who carved the gravestone carved that death's head to reflect Venture's African heritage. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, ladies. We don't have any questions at the moment, so I certainly encourage anyone who's attending, if you have any questions for either Dr. Steenburg or Elizabeth, please feel free to submit them down at the bottom of your screen through the Q&A.
Betty Jo, while we're waiting for questions, I can share a couple legends about Venture that people might find interesting.
That would be wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, now this is from all the research we've done, people have maintained legends and stories. I have no idea if they're true, but one of the legends was that Venture said that when he and Meg got married, he took a heavy rope and threw it over the roof of the building. And he put Meg on one side and he put himself on the other, and he told Meg to pull on the rope. Meg was unable to pull the rope over. He told Meg to come over to his side, and together, working as a pair, they could pull the rope over. So that was his idea of marriage as a partnership. Another story which I love is that Venture, while he was enslaved by Thomas Stanton II, was known as a very successful wrestler. Remember, I said earlier, he was 6'1" to 6'3". We actually know this because the state archaeologist Nick Bellantoni did a dig at Venture's grave about 10 years ago. And the imprint from Venture's coffin was more than 6.5 feet long. So Venture was at least tall enough to fit in that coffin. But Venture was working, and in Stonington, a member of the Dennison family, a young man home from Dartmouth College for vacation, had heard that Venture was a wrestler, and he decided to go challenge Venture to a wrestling match. So he walked over to the Stanton's farm, and he walked up to Venture and challenged him. Venture squatted down, and put his hand on the ground. He then told Dennison to stand on his hand, and Venture stood up and raised Dennison's feet to Venture's waist, held him there, and then lowered him to the ground again. Mr. Dennison went home.
That's great.
Venture, yes?
She said that's great.
Oh, okay.
Have
Then
some
what-
coming in. I don't mean to interrupt you,
Oh,
but
no, go ahead.
somebody has asked, is the area around Venture Rock currently accessible?
It is in Barn Island. It is off the parking lot, which is off Stewart Road. If you do a Google Earth check, Stewart Road goes off Greenhaven Road, right opposite Mary Hall Road. And you go about a quarter of a mile down Stewart Road, and there is a almost hidden dirt driveway. You would think it doesn't go anywhere. It leads up to a parking lot. The parking lot is actually on the site of the Thomas Stanton second house, which the state of Connecticut basically filled the foundation, destroyed the remaining, edges of the foundation about now 20 years ago. That's where we started. And from there, using Google Earth, you can see the Venture Rock. I'm hoping this spring, once more people are vaccinated, that I will lead a walk from that parking lot. Liz and I together will lead a walk from that parking lot to the Venture Glacial Erratic and to the site of Venture's homestead.
Let us know when that's going to be.
Absolutely.
I think, Amanda, that's it for questions right now. But we did have several people who said to us what a great presentation.
Oh.
So we thank you, Dr. Steenburg and Liz, for joining us tonight, for introducing us to Venture Smith. It was such a powerful and important presentation, and we thank you for being part of our Community Voices program. It really was wonderful. If you would like more information about Venture Smith and his writings, they can be found at the Westerly Library and at your local library if you're visiting or viewing us from somewhere else. And also, we'll look forward to that permanent display in Stonington. So
Betty Jo, I want to add two things.
Yes.
Venture's narrative is available online at the University of North Carolina website. Just Google a narrative of the life of Venture. And it's also available in print form. I believe the Stonington Historical Society has copies for $5 a copy, as does the New London County Historical Society. And then one little glimmer that I found so hysterical in Louis Gates' genealogy series on TV.
Finding Your Roots.
Finding Your Roots. Ted Danson is descended from Oliver Smith. So Liz and I provided some of our research to Gates for the program on Ted Danson, finding that his umpty-ump great-grandfather was a slave owner.
That's wonderful. I believe the Westerly Sun had done a story on that when it happened. So we're very, very pleased that you were able to provide that information. And I'm sure that other people will be in touch with you now. That is one of the questions that I had. If someone wanted to get in touch with either one of you, what's the best way to do that? Because I'm sure there'll be additional questions.
You can use my Yukon email, which is nancy.steenburg, STEENBURG @yukon.edu. And Liz's email is
EKADING@hotmail.com.
Great. Well, again, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And I also want to take just a moment to thank our Westerly Library and Wilcox Park staffs during this is National Library Week. So we want to thank them for all they do, especially our Amanda Wagner, who takes care of these Community Voices programs for us. And I also want to thank all of you who are watching tonight. We appreciate all of your help keeping our library and our park in tip-top shape. We know that we really appreciate all of you, and we know that you're enjoying the park, especially during these COVID times. And we do want to throw out a challenge to our generous donors during National Library Week to help us reach our goal of 250 donations before Sunday. So if you'd like more information on that, we invite you to join us and visit our website if you'd like more information. And please also check our website for information on our May program that will be updated later this month. So again, we thank you both, Liz and Nancy, for
Welcome.
a fabulous program. This was recorded, as Amanda mentioned earlier, so we'll let you know where this program can be found. And we wish you all a great evening, and please stay safe.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Welcome.
ladies, and thank you to you too, Betty Jo. Thank you so much for that.
Oh, we can't do it without you, Amanda. You're important.
Thank you. Take care, everyone. Good night, everyone.
Have a
Good
great
night.
night, everyone.